I would like now to introduce Aaron Good. Aaron Good has a PhD in political science from Temple University. Prior to completing his doctorate, he worked on the 2008 Obama campaign in Missouri. Born and raised in Indiana, he has since lived and worked in Taiwan and Shanghai. In 2002, an expanded and revised version of his doctoral dissertation was published by Skyhorse under the title American Exception, Empire and the Deep State. A Japanese translation of American Exception is nearly complete. A documentary film based on the book is also coming in the near future. Aaron Good currently resides with his wife and son in the greater Philadelphia area and is the host of the American Exception podcast on Patreon. Aaron?
Okay, I have a presentation that should be up in a moment here, and I would like to dedicate this to Lance DeHaven Smith. If he had not died so suddenly, I mean, he had a bout with cancer. His health really rapidly declined when he retired from Florida State, and he would be here. He'd be here speaking. He was one of the few tenured, esteemed, prestigious officials or public administration scholars who spoke out about 9/11, and he was friendly with government, Florida State government people and so on. He was just an irreplaceable person. So I wish Lance were here. I also want to acknowledge David Talbot, who also has been taken out of the scene of people investigating America's real history. He had a stroke, his second stroke. David and I were planning on writing a book based on the things that I'm going to talk about today. We had actually planned to write two books together. One of them was on the RFK assassination, and the other was on the neoconservative takeover of U.S. foreign policy, which is what I'm going to talk about essentially. The title here is The Gray Alliance, How Neoconservatism Took Over the American Deep State, and this is looking at these issues in a totally different way than the speakers up to now. This is less about 9/11. It's very little about 9/11. It's more about the issue of how the apex of power can be captured by forces that are totally antithetical to democracy and to the rule of law. 9/11 was not the first time that this regime entered politics in a dramatic way and influenced supposedly democratic American politics. So I want to talk, I've written about the exception, which is the rule of law being violated by officials in a supposed case of emergency. But recently I've been thinking more and more about the fix, and so, which is something that we intuitively understand. The fix is in here and there. If you want to be running any sort of criminal racket in a town, you need the fix, right? So I tried to write a definition of this the other day in preparation of this. An institutionalized deep political arrangement in which law enforcement is neutralized in relation to a going, rent-seeking criminal enterprise, i.e. a racket. So the exception might be an official breaks the law, orders an assassination, even though it's against the law, right? That would be an example of the exception in action. But what do you really call it when the National Crime Syndicate is allowed to have a monopoly on drug distribution in the United States for decades? Perhaps, probably, essentially still up to the present. That's not the exception. That's not one official doing something bad. That's something deeper, and that is some variation of the fix. So the Cold War served as the bureaucratic rationale for U.S. exceptionism, the institutionalized abrogation of the rule of law in response to an existential threat to the state, which is what the national security state, U.S. leaders deemed communism to be. Such a threat that we had to break all these laws secretly, covertly, because then, we need to win the battle of hearts and minds. So we can't tell people we're committing all these crimes. We have to do it covertly. But the reason is the existential threat. The deep state fix that I'm trying to expand on here is an example of Peter Dale Scott's Gray Alliance, and it resulted from, this is a deeper fix. We could call it the apex fix, we call it the deep fix, but it's something that's more than just like the corruption in a certain town or state where the mob might have sway. It's something much deeper. It's attached to the apex, or it's essentially condoned and protected by the apex of power in the United States. And it resulted, what happens after World War II is a result of the coincidence of the consolidation of the national crime syndicate in the mid-20th century. That's part one. And then B, the consolidation of the imperial US national security state, whose command posts were vested with overriding power, which is to say exceptionalist prerogative powers, powers to ignore the law when you deem it expedient. Key figures in this deep state fix include the heads of the FBI, or FBI twice, CIA, actually the second FBI is supposed to be FBN, Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and CIA counterintelligence / operations, even the director of Central Intelligence at the time. So people like Harry Anslinger, head of the Bureau of Narcotics, J. Edgar Hoover, James Angleton, Richard Helms, Allen Dulles. These are key figures in the early years of post-World War II US empire that led to the establishment and sort of the entrenchment of a kind of fix related to connected to organized crime. I wrote about the Kennedy assassination a lot and the mystery of who did the Kennedy assassination. And on this, fundamentally, it's pretty straightforward. Kennedy was killed by the regime. The regime is not the state. In political science terms, the regime is all of those institutions which determine who actually has control of the state. So you can have a democratic regime, you can have a one-party regime, you can have a communist regime. There's different ways to think about it, but it's something bigger. And we're taught that the US has a lawful, open, democratic regime characterized by the rule of law and elections and so on. But if you can assassinate the most popular president, according to Gallup polls since the end of World War II, JFK, if you can assassinate him and then lie about it brazenly for decades, then the regime must be something besides just a lawful democratic regime. And if you understand that, you can understand how something like 9/11 could be pulled off. Or you can just think, Oswald, one lone nut killed the president, and then another lone nut killed him. These things happen, okay? But you probably, none of the people in this room think that way. Okay, my dissertation in the book, Empire and the Deep State, the title kind of says it all. American exception. The exception is a violation of the rule of law that's just baked into the way we are governed. Empire, imperialism, is a reference to the US quest for global dominance at the end of World War II, which, contrary to what the senator said, is not something that we stumbled into or reluctantly took over. This was something planned by the apex of Wall Street power, the Council on Foreign Relations. Allen Dulles was the vice president at the time, and he wrote one of the volumes of a World War II study where they basically planned out how they were going to manage global capitalism after the war. So it wasn't an accident. We didn't find ourselves accidentally running the world. It was planned by the richest, most powerful people in the world. But it wasn't packaged that way. It was packaged as an American century, and it was all about freedom, okay? And the deep state is the actual nature of the regime. It's not visible. It's something deeper. It's oligarchic and top-down. Okay, now a diagram here to explain the sort of tripartite structure of the state. You have the public state, democracy, you know, Congress, the president, and all of this, but you have the national security state, which is supposed to protect the public state. But I argue that you can't even really understand things by just looking at those two forces, those two parts of the state. There is something deeper, which I choose to represent with the Wall Street bull, because it's really the power of oligarchy. Our issue is not a bunch of bureaucrats doing bureaucrat things. It's the richest, most powerful people in the world who control the state. And they especially have links to the national security state and can use it to advance their interests. Like when the CIA overthrows a government so that a US corporation can come in and exploit their most valuable resources, which we do again and again. Venezuela seems to be in the crosshairs right now. I'm sorry to disappoint anyone who thinks that's really about drugs, because it's not. The other way you can think of the deep state is as a regime type. And then the only real difference is you've got the public state, the security state, but you also have civil society. okay? And it's outside of the government, but the media, the foundations, academia, even religious groups, labor unions, all these things that could be part of civil society and could influence the way that politics works in America and the way that people think about politics. But really, again, you have deep political power, oligarchic power, the power of organized money, and it's this sort of deep political influence that even manipulates civil society. You know, you can get a job at a think tank if you're a good imperialist, but you really cannot if you are opposed to imperialism or if you're a critic of capitalism. So this is the way that they define what are acceptable perspectives and things for people to say and think. It has a big influence on people in America. We're all shaped by the culture we grow up in and the institutions that help us to try to make sense of the world. And yes, they manipulate us a lot, and they make us think things that people with money want us to think. I owe a tremendous debt to Peter Dale Scott, who is a dear friend, collaborator, and big inspiration to me. And a lot of my thinking is based on his writing. And I did an oral history with him, which included hours and hours of interviews with him about his life, because he was a person looking at these things since the 60s. He's been probably the most serious academic to write about them. And in recent years, the last couple of years, I began to look closely more at his work and think about policies in the Middle East. And I came to realize that Peter has this blind spot when it came to discussing Zionism and the influence of Israel in the U.S. politics and in the events that he studies. And the more that I spoke to him about this, the more kind of shocked I was, because the influence is profound at certain key points in the history that he would talk about, but he wouldn't speak about it. And it has mostly to do with the fact that he received credible death threats at certain times that dissuaded him from this. He's also married to a person who is loyal to Zionism, and so this is, another factor as well. But he just will not speak about these things publicly, even now. But I speak to him a good bit of the time, pretty regularly. I talked to him for 2 hours a couple of weeks ago. And I think that even though he will not speak about these things, his body of work has more explosive, kind of mind-blowing implications about this than anyone else that I can think of. So I could fault him for not speaking out now, but he's done this amazing work so far, and he's really a brilliant individual. He was best friends with Dan Ellsberg. He once had dinner in Huey Newton's apartment with Donald Fried. He was in Bernard Finsterwald's office when James McCord came in. I mean, just things where that he tells me, they're amazing to me. I can't believe that. But anyway, I'm going to be jumping around here a bit, but I wanted to put this, even though this is going to go sort of from the past to the present, I want to point out something very strange.
I want to talk about a story that is a few years old now, but is of significance, I believe, in terms of understanding the relationship between the Israeli intelligence apparatus and the American deep state, the Western deep state. And in this case, this is information that came out in a Gray Zone article by Max Blumenthal in May of 2020. And the headline is, "The American Friends, New Court Files Expose Sheldon Adelson's Security Team in U.S. Spy Operation Against Julian Assange." And the subtitle says, "An exclusive investigation by Gray Zone reveals new details on the critical role Sheldon Adelson's Las Vegas Sands played in an apparent CIA spying operation targeting Julian Assange and exposes the Sands security staff who helped coordinate the malicious campaign." Okay, so when Pompeo, as CIA director, wanted to go after Julian Assange, and these plans, by the way, eventually came to include assassination plots, and this came out in Spanish court proceedings. But the key for us, or the significance for us, is that why, if the CIA, which is an organization that has been known to be involved in assassinations in the past, if they want someone killed in the 21st century, why are they outsourcing this to Sheldon Adelson, who is obviously an agent of Israel? He and his wife are obsessed with this issue. I don't even need to talk about Sheldon and Miriam Adelson to people watching this, I assume. But the other part of it is the outfit that was handling this was Adelson's Las Vegas Sands Casino, which is literally a Lansky joint. And we have to think about this in the context of James Angleton and his assassination apparatus that he controlled, at least on some level, and the people that it deployed, because it deployed people from that same Las Vegas super Zionist milieu of like people like Meyer Lansky and associates of Meyer Lansky, including Meyer Lansky's close associate in Mexico who helped set up his Mexican drug connection, Harold Happy Meltzer, right? He was one of these people involved in this Angleton era, 50s, 60s assassination apparatus. And consider also that James Angleton had an Israeli intelligence officer managing all of the business in Cuba, the assassination plots and so on. This has not really been known until very recently with Angleton's church committee testimony, some of which I found. I'm apparently the only person that has tracked this down, but a page that was deleted, as we'll talk about in this presentation, that shows that the President of the United States, of course, but also the director of the CIA under Kennedy, John McCone, was not aware that this extremely sensitive operation and whole group of operations, including assassination plots against Castro, was being managed and handled not by a CIA person, but by an Israeli intelligence officer, because Angleton said, oh, well, the CIA is too compromised. There's too many moles, so I have to use somebody that nobody else knows anything about. But what it really did was it gave Angleton essentially a way to have an assassination apparatus that really couldn't be reviewed or even understood by other people, even the director of the CIA, much less the president. So this is very significant that you've got this same relationship. These people who are running casinos, and casinos are, as Lansky created Las Vegas in the first place, the modern Las Vegas, as a way to launder drug money from his Mexican drug connection, which was established by one of these big CIA, or one of these big, the assassination apparatus under that Angleton was handling at this time included people from that Las Vegas milieu. People like Harold Meltzer, who, as I mentioned, was the guy that Lansky set up to in Mexico City to set up this heroin connection in the mid 40s. And this the modern Las Vegas was founded at around this time in order to manage and launder the money that was going to be generated from this Mexican heroin connection. So you need these casinos because they allow you to launder massive amounts of money. So who knows how the Sands makes all its money now, but they're like these huge contributors to the Republican Party, the biggest contributors as I understand it. And the money comes from Las Vegas Sands Casino, except it's in Macau now. But that was originally a Lansky joint. I mean, this is a company, it's the same thing. This super Zionist person handling his own Murder Incorporated. And it traces directly back to the Lansky milieu and the Murder Incorporated arrangement that the CIA had with the global crime syndicate. So this, I think, is very important, and people should think about this as an important part of the regime that we live under. I also want to talk about JFK and something I think very relevant that not too many people have commented on, and it comes from Andre Gromyko's memoirs. And this was a person who was close to Kennedy and spent time in the Kennedy White House, and then he later wrote his memoirs, and he's talking about conversations with JFK. And in this book, he writes that JFK was talking about the internal situation in the U.S., and JFK, of course, wanted to pursue détente, talked about ending the Cold War, gave the peace speech at American University about ending the Cold War. He was working to potentially even normalize relations with Castro in Cuba, Castro's Cuba. And so, Kennedy was pursuing détente. He was pursuing an end to the Cold War, potentially. So here's what JFK told to Gromyko. He said, the fact is there are two groups of the American population which are not always pleased when relations between our two countries are eased. One group consists of people who are always opposed to improvement for ideological reasons. These would, of course, be orthodox Cold Warriors, super militarists, right-wingers, military-industrial complex types, people like J. Edgar Hoover, Texas oilmen with very right-wing politics, etc.
The other group are people of a particular nationality. He meant the Jewish lobby. This is what he would write about it then. We say Israel lobby now, but they used Israel or Jewish lobby back then, who think that always and under all circumstances, the Kremlin will support Arabs and be an enemy of Israel. This group has effective means for making improvement between our countries very difficult. So even now, we think of the neocons and their influence on policy, their ties to Zionism. But even back in the early 60s, JFK says, look, I've got two groups here that make it really hard to relax the Cold War. Cold War militarists and, right-wing fanatics, basically, and then Zionists. They make it, and they're powerful enough to have an influence to do this. So he's trying to explain the president isn't all powerful. He's got to somehow deal with domestic forces. And so Gromyko says that, we both kind of agree that the Palestinians should have a homeland in Israel. I don't see why we can't, why the Zionists don't want us to have better relations. And Kennedy just says, well, I want to just try to explain these things to you. And then Gromyko says at the end, I don't know why, but when I first heard about his murder, it was that talk on the White House terrace that came into my mind, what he said about there being opponents to his policy. So I think that this basically captures the coalition that did get rid of Kennedy. You have Cold War militarists, people who are proponents of the U.S. empire who benefit from it. But additionally, there's more evidence that Zionist actors and agents of Israel were involved in some ways that have only totally come to light, and I won't say totally, but have been more confirmed recently. And I'll try to explain this. James Angleton is a very key figure for this era. The only time that the U.S. really went after the Vegas syndicate in a serious way was under Robert F. Kennedy and his investigations of the Teamsters and the Las Vegas skim and so on. And at one point, RFK's Justice Department asks a CIA officer named John Whitten to investigate Panamanian bank accounts that are being used to move the Lansky skim around, or the Vegas skim, the extra money that they would take out. And he testifies about this in the 70s to the Church Committee, and here's what he said. At the time, we were in an excellent position to do this. I thought it was a great idea. Promptly, this came to Angleton's attention, and we had to brief him on it, and he said, well, we're not going to have anything to do with this. This is the FBI's business, and whammo, end of conversation. We were called off. I went to J.C. King, who was the chief of Western Hemisphere Division, and told him this, and J.C. King said, well, Angleton has these ties to the mafia, and he's not going to do anything to jeopardize them. And then I said, I didn't know that, and he said, yeah, it had to do with Cuba. Cuba, which is, of course, where Lansky had his casino. Now, Peter Dale Scott does write about this. He does write about Israel some in his book, especially American War Machine and Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, except in that book he writes more about Lansky. But here's what Scott says. Angleton's defense of Lansky's skim cannot be separated from his second function in the CIA as handler of the Israeli desk. Angleton's connections with Mossad date back to World War II, when he coordinated OSS operations in Italy with the Jewish underground headed locally by Teddy Kollek, who later becomes the mayor of Jerusalem. So Angleton has these deep ties to the mob and to Zionists, and of course Lansky is pretty famous now as a Zionist. He's one of the main people who funneled arms to them in 1948. And the other time that the U.S. does go after him for a brief moment under Nixon, he flees to Israel, and he basically rides it out until the end of 72, early 73, and by then Nixon's suffering under Watergate, which I'm going to try to talk about. Now, I'm going to try to skip ahead here or briefly go through these just in the interest of time, but one thing that I discovered recently was that in Angleton's 1975 Church Committee testimony, he admits to, and this is censored, it was redacted and then later deleted, as I'll show, he admits that the person handling all of the Murder Incorporated, assassination business, Kill Castro plots, the person that was handling this was not a CIA officer, it was a Mossad officer. And this was unknown until, I haven't seen anybody else write about this before me. So the significance of this is it was hard for people studying the Kennedy assassination to get documents on the CIA that dealt with their assassination apparatus. And I think that this is why. A lot of it was handled by Mossad. I think they outsourced some of these things, and that was a key part of it. But additionally, the other people that would have been involved, I think, were folded into other programs, especially MK Ultra, it seems, is a part of this. And those records were all destroyed when Helms was afraid that the CIA might get blamed for Watergate for good reason. And so he ordered all the MK Ultra files destroyed. Okay. The reason that Angleton said he had to do this was because he felt the CIA was so penetrated with Soviets that you just couldn't actually use the CIA for CIA operations. You needed somebody who was he was extra confident in, and it was a Mossad officer. This is his excuse for this. But of course, the Cold War and communists around every corner, under every bit, is the way they justified everything. And the only people that knew about this were Dick Helms and William Harvey, notorious William Harvey, if you're familiar with CIA history. And you get the impression also that there were few CIA people even involved in what was going on in Cuba, or otherwise, you know, that if they're all penetrated by the Soviets, it wouldn't have made any sense. So it seems that the Israeli person was really running it all. Now, what was missing from this testimony that I found somehow in an older version that was released, but if you look at the ones that have come out every time since then with redactions and so on, this page is totally missing, but I found it on a earlier version that was really incomplete, so it didn't really make any sense, but I found the page. And in this page, they delete it for reasons you can try to figure out. But Angleton is asked, well, did you tell the director of the CIA that you were using an Israeli to handle the assassination plots and terror plots in Cuba? Like, that seems significant. And Angleton at first says, oh, yeah, he knew. And then they ask him more about it, and he says, well, a little thing like that is not something you go and bother the director about, right? So nobody really knew about this. The president didn't know about it. The head of the CIA didn't know about it. It was just Richard Helms, who was the deputy director of plans. He eventually became the director. And then Angleton and William Harvey. I assume William Harvey knew. So this is, he's the assassination apparatus, the most sensitive apparatus in the CIA is not under the director doesn't even know that it works. They don't know about the assassination plots against Castro, and the president obviously doesn't know. It's this private foreign policy carried out by national security people. So what the significance of the Lansky role and the Teamster role in the crime syndicate is that when the U.S. started to look at this national crime syndicate as a problem, they first don't want to admit that it was real at all. But then when they as they have to, because there's just too much evidence for it, they blame it on the Italians. They say it's this Italian mafia thing, which is not baseless. They're really a part of it. I call it the Lansky Teamster Syndicate, but if I'm being more honest, it's really Lansky Teamster Mafia. Okay, and the Teamsters are a big part of this. They were back then. But this is when Robert Kennedy becomes Attorney General, he doesn't go after this Italian model of the mafia. He says it's a syndicate. The Teamsters are a huge part of it. That's why he goes after Hoffa. And he tries to investigate the Vegas skim. Because Vegas, the city itself, was created by Meyer Lansky in 1946. And the reason it was created is because in 1945, he takes this guy named Harry Meltzer, along with some other mobsters with a lot of money. They set him up in Mexico, and he becomes like the heroin kingpin of the west coast of the United States. But if you're going to make all that money, you've got to have a way to launder it, and that's why they make Las Vegas. That's the whole city, which is still, even today, they want to assassinate someone, and they go to Vegas and Lansky connected things. It's almost unbelievable, but there it is. So Robert Kennedy was saying something different about this. Peter Dale Scott, in his writings, talks about how there's a CIA global drug connection. He has a book called American War Machine on this. And he points out how it's been a connected thing throughout all of these scandals, like the JFK assassination, Watergate, Iran-Contra, 9/11, that you have the drug traffic is involved. And this was confusing to me in some ways because it's so discursive, but he is correct that it does pop up in all these cases. I mean, everybody remembers Gary Webb, right? What's less well known is what Nixon was doing, his war on drugs, but that was significant. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then the Kennedys were not only going after the money laundering headquarters in Vegas, but they attempted to go more after the wholesale networks and the bigger distribution networks rather than trying to go after low-level dealers and so on. It was a real change in approach to the drug problem in the U.S. So what's significant about the Kennedy assassination in regards to this is that Jack Ruby is the most absurdly suspicious character you can imagine. I have a timeline of Lansky, and I think I'll explain more about it, but the real issue with Jack Ruby and the fact that he was in custody and it made it impossible really to investigate the assassination was that he sat at the center of such explosive and lucrative state/establishment criminality that the government could not possibly allow him to reveal the truth of Dallas. For one, expose as corrupt and criminal many prominent persons in the U.S., and secondly, it would damage U.S. prestige in the war of ideas against the global communist conspiracy, which is essentially what we organized all of political life and foreign policy around, in the Cold War. So there were two blackmail things built into the Kennedy plot. Lyndon Johnson tells Earl Warren, you can't investigate this. You need to put this conspiracy talk to bed because we think it's the Soviets, but if we say that, it'll lead to nuclear war and everybody will die. So you need to actually put this thing to bed. This is how he got Earl Warren to be on the Warren Commission to chair the investigation. But additionally, with Ruby in jail, you're saying it'll blow up the world, literally, if we investigate this. That's what Earl Warren is more or less told. And then with Ruby, it isn't said, but it's known by any person with any connection to the syndicate and the drug traffic in the US, which is pretty much a nationwide thing now, that it would upset so many apple carts if you investigated this, because he's tied to Teamster corruption and the drug trade. He was essentially the syndicate. After the assassination, a guy named Kuttner, I think it's Louis Kuttner, came forward and said, yeah, I worked with him on the Kefauver hearings back in 1950, and he was a syndicate lieutenant in Dallas. And the deal was he would explain what was going on in Chicago, where he used to live, if you just didn't mess with Dallas. That was what this guy said. The Warren Commission just ignored him saying that. The Warren Commission says Ruby had no ties to organized crime, which is very funny. Coincidentally, two people in the 60s assassinations, two key figures, Sirhan and Jack Ruby, both worked at the Santa Anita racetrack, which was essentially under the purview of Johnny Rosselli, who was the person that the CIA reached out to when they wanted to assassinate Castro. So that could be a coincidence, but it's very, strange. So here's what Peter writes about this, about concealing Ruby and his ties to crime. What's being protected is not a one-time arrangement or an arrangement in Ruby's lifetime, but a more institutionalized arrangement between the mob and the government, initiated in the era of Hoover and Lansky, but outlasting them and perhaps enduring down to the present. And then he points out also, Lansky was one of the top 3 organized crime figures who were never tapped or bugged by the FBI. The other 2 were Marcello and Santo Trafficante. And when I explain the Lansky timeline, hopefully it'll make more sense. Here it is. 1937, Lansky works with the government to help them take down the head of Murder Incorporated, which he had helped establish, which was the nationwide syndicate assassination network. And Buckhalter was also the biggest drug dealer in the nation. Lansky takes him out. He eventually becomes the biggest drug dealer in the country, but he's essentially a stool pigeon of some kind. He helps to arrange the arrest and conviction of Louis Buckhalter, and this endears him to, or well, I don't know what the word is, but for whatever the reason, the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry Anslinger, never go after Lansky. In 1939, you have the murder of Leon Cook. He was the head of a junk handlers union in Chicago, and it was a syndicate murder, and it's written about in Robert Kennedy's book as the moment that allowed the mob to take over the Teamster Pension Fund. And one of the things the Teamster Pension Fund did was big real estate deals, casino deals in Las Vegas to build these huge casinos, and then those casinos attract a lot of people, high volume, and then you can put a lot of drug money into them and you launder it that way. It seems to be about what happened. Now, the strange thing about the murder of Leon Cook is the only person other person in the room was Jack Ruby. In this key moment here, right? 1943, so, go figure. And it was friends of his that were later blamed for it. I think Sam Yaris or Dave Yaris and another, Lenny Patrick maybe, but some of these mob names get mixed up in my mind, but it was associates of Ruby who were eventually blamed for that murder. Or wait, I take it back. The Leon Cook murder, they don't quite know. That was the James Reagan murder, but I'll talk about that in a second. In 1943, Operation Underworld takes place, and the Office of Naval Intelligence and the OSS work with Meyer Lansky. And Meyer Lansky says, I can help you to protect the docks, because the mob has a presence there, but you need to help me spring my friend Lucky Luciano from jail so we can help America in World War II. They do that. 1945, Meyer Lansky receives Medal of Freedom from Harry Truman, and also his Mexican drug connection begins running as well. So I don't know of anybody else who receives a Medal of Freedom from the president and establishes a big drug syndicate in Mexico City or anywhere in the same year. That's a busy year. 1946, the James Reagan murder. That's the one, Lenny Patrick and Dave Yaris. These are also associates of Jack Ruby. And the significance of the James Reagan murder is that it allows the syndicate to take over the National Racing Wire, which is this nationwide gambling, basically a phone network, telegraph network, but it would tell you the racing results. And if you could control it in the town, you basically controlled the illegal gambling, and then you would have to bribe policemen and so on. But once you bribe the policemen in a town and other people are taking money for it, just for the gambling, then you kind of got them for everything else too. It's the way the national syndicate was able to expand and corrupt and become a national crime syndicate. And also the same year that the Flamingo in Vegas begins operating, and that was run by Bugsy Siegel. Bugsy Siegel was probably killed not because of what Warren Beatty says in his movie and so on. It was probably over the racing wire, because he wanted to control the racing wire, and so there was this rivalry. It ends up going to these other more powerful people than Siegel. I'm not going to read too much about the Teamsters, but I really recommend the book for all of these subjects. Sally Denton and Roger Morris wrote The Money and the Power on Vegas, and they write about how the Teamsters were implicated in the syndicate's drug trafficking. They shared office with drug dealers. They were depository or drops for drug money. And what they write here is the drug trade was already by 1960 so enmeshed with government intelligence and providing large amounts of money to politicians in both parties. And these drug connections are added proof of the pervasiveness of an integration of the syndicate of Las Vegas, and proved again the folly of an Italian surnamed, simplistically criminal view of the system. So the issue with the crime syndicate is not merely the hoodlums, it's that it is intertwined with the wealthy capitalist people who are, legitimate. I'm not going to read this whole thing on Paul Helliwell, but he is a significant character for establishing the covert operations and drug trafficking networks at the same time. And as Peter Dale Scott writes, Paul Helliwell must be considered part of Meyer Lansky's milieu. And then I write more about this here. To reestablish the Southeast Asian drug connection in the early post-war years, Helliwell may have had Lansky funds to do this. He represented, among other things, Helliwell, this CIA OSS lawyer fellow, and Lansky lawyer, he represented an outfit called the Eastern Development Company, a firm that cooperated with Lansky and his Las Vegas friend and fellow Zionist agent Hank Greenspun in the mid-40s to supply arms to the Zionists who would establish Israel. And his subsequent connections to Lansky are less ambiguous. He was the owner of the Bank of Perrine, which was a two-time laundromat for Lansky and the CIA. This was in Florida. Also connected to Lansky through the Miami National Bank. Helliwell was legal counsel for this small bank used by Lansky to launder money from abroad, along with Las Vegas casino skim. Vegas asks whether Helliwell's connections to Lansky's Bank of World Commerce, and then Tibor Rosenbaum, this notorious financier, super Zionist, but also connected to organized crime, if it did not constitute a connection to the Mossad. Well, I would say it does, as does his connections to Helliwell's, or to Lansky's bank in Florida, the Miami National Bank. So this is a person who is a key CIA figure, but also a mob figure, and it's hard to even say, is he more of a spook or a mobster? And that's really the heart of the issue, is how do we even describe these things? I'm going to skip ahead here. I want to point out a key shift in U.S. foreign policy because it's a sort of a cliche or a tenet of the left that of imperialist critics that, well, the policy never changes. It's merely a function of, capitalists, imperialists who have managed geopolitics to accumulate more capital and so on. Well, there are changes in U.S. policy. In 1956, they tried something similar, like a land grab, like they did in 1967, essentially. This one involved the Israelis, the French, and the British, but really the Israelis would have been the big beneficiary of it, but Israel would have been saved as well because Nasser wanted to nationalize the Suez Canal, which he did. And you end up getting the Suez crisis. But in that year, Dwight Eisenhower said, this is unacceptable, and that was the end of it. It wasn't allowed to stand. And they were not the Zionists and the British, people who are sympathetic to Zionism because it's also intertwined with the British Empire. They were not happy about this. And they also at that time, they tried to use the Muslim Brotherhood to assassinate Nasser, which goes, the Islamists are kind of useful sock puppets for Western imperialism, as we see on 9/11. Another interesting thing that gets into the same milieu is a meeting that I found out about thanks to Ola Tanander, and he knew about it thanks to his friend Dirk Pullman. But in 1962, September, a high-ranking U.S. military officer met with Nazi assassin Otto Skorzeny to complain about JFK. And he says basically all the people advising JFK are wussies. They don't believe in the superiority of the West. It's just a disaster. And also, he's giving too much money to the inward states, i.e., African nation states. So these are people of a right-wing bent, let's just say, the ex-Nazi and this Air Force person. So, you don't go to Otto Skorzeny to talk about your feelings or to talk about foreign policy. He's an assassin. He's a terrorist. Some researchers believe that he may have been the QJ Win character because there are these references to Spain in the discussions over this. QJ Win was a assassination cryptonym. It was either one person or a few. It's complicated, but regardless, this may be a key to understanding it because Skorzeny, before he did this, very shortly before, I think like a week before, Skorzeny killed a German scientist who was working for Nasser. And he did this on behalf of Israel, of Mossad. The story is that these Mossad agents found him and he said, "Don't kill me." And they say, "Well, we need you to do some work for us. And then maybe we can get these other, Nazi hunters off your back if you go and kill this scientist for us." That's the story they tell. So it may well be that some sort of similar network was involved with the JFK assassination, involving Mossad perhaps. Okay, now the significance of this is, and Peter wrote about this in one of his books that did not get published. He has 2 books on JFK that have not been published. One of them was essentially disappeared, even though it was written up in Publishers Weekly. He got a good advance for it, and it just disappeared. It never came out. We've tracked some of these down. I have these manuscripts or copies of them, and in one of them, Peter writes, Israel would not have killed JFK. It would have been suicidal to do this. Now, but they do seem to have been involved in the operations, which is not something he says years later publicly or in his books. He says it would have been suicidal. They wouldn't have done it without a higher authority. And that, I think, is key to understanding the assassination. What's significant about it is that Israel has used this role in the clandestine deep state. If JFK is the head of state, he's not a powerless person. He's the president of the United States. He has a lot of control over the bureaucracy. So if you're going to kill him, you're going to have to get creative to be able to get away with it. And additionally, his brother is the top lawman in the country. It's no small thing to have done this. But so they do this, I think, using secret aspects of the military, like especially the continuity of government, doomsday machine emergency networks, that in case there's a nuclear war, you can say that you have these emergency powers. I think something like that was invoked. But then the management of it was probably Angleton's CIA within the CIA, connected to Mossad and the National Crime Syndicate. And by using the National Crime Syndicate, you're able to capitalize on the fact that it's got this network of corruption throughout the whole country. So you have all these ways to lean on people and manipulate them. And what happens after this This may or may not be accurate. This is a bit speculation, but there's three things that happen in March, February of 1967. They revolve around the Kennedy assassination, and they're all connected to the syndicate as well. Ramparts magazine exposes the CIA's manipulation of student groups and so on, okay? And it turns out that this article, which is famous, it's the biggest scandal in the CIA up to that point, it's written by a guy named Sol Stern in Ramparts magazine, and I was suspicious about this, so I was like, who is this guy that wrote this? Because it just happens before the 67 war, and it seems to have had an impact on this. Well, the guy was named Sol Stern. He was born in Mandatory Palestine. Shortly after this is written, he becomes a hard right-winger, and he spends the rest of his life writing for like the Manhattan Institute and other super Zionist think tanks. And he writes about essentially like the PLO are all terrorists and you can't negotiate with them, basically a hardline Zionist. So, okay, I guess that could be a coincidence, but I also found the CIA's historian wrote an article in like 2010 maybe, and he says, in 67, in the summer, CIA was in the worst position ever. You had this expose in Ramparts, you had these other scandals, and so they wanted to please the president, and so they essentially tell the president what he wants to hear about the Six-Day War because LBJ is a huge Zionist. Additionally, in February, March 1967, Clay Shaw gets indicted by Jim Garrison, and I don't claim to understand the whole Jim Garrison issue, and Peter Dale Scott and others have been anti-Garrison, even though they're interested in the case. But people like Oliver Stone and Jim DiEugenio and others really like Garrison's case, and they think he was, on the up and up. I'm agnostic about it, ultimately, but it's worth noting that the guy that tells him to investigate the assassination is Russell Long, who's one of the most Teamster-connected, corrupt, and powerful people, a Louisiana senator. So this is very strange. Robert Kennedy's close friend, Walter Sheridan, essentially thought that the whole Garrison investigation was related to an effort to get Hoffa out of jail. So make of that what you will. Additionally, though, Drew Pearson and Jack Anderson write about how JFK could have been killed by some CIA operations, and it reveals for the first time the CIA mob plots against Castro. So this is these are three things that happened, bam, 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 months before the Six-Day War, and the person that was feeding them, and Jack Anderson and Drew Pearson, the columnist, this information, was a lawyer for Johnny Rosselli. And the logic of him doing this doesn't really make much sense. So I would wonder if this is a coordinated, effort, but it's hard to say, perfectly. Watergate, as Peter wrote, has many connections to the JFK assassination, and I'll try to go through some of these and the events that happened at the time. But the 68 Traficante visits Saigon, so these CIA-connected forces are doing things with the drug trade there, and Traficante, they're looking to use more of the Southeast Asian traffic and maybe supplant some of the Mexican traffic. And at the same time, there's an effort to actually go after Lansky that's very strange. So in early 1970, Lansky has this meeting, I think it's in Acapulco, and then he comes out and he essentially gives up control of the drug trafficking operations. And he gets arrested in the US for the first time on very trivial charges, but he senses the government's coming after him, so he goes to Israel. And additionally, in Las Vegas, there's this strange episode with Howard Hughes, and he is taking over these casinos that were run by the Lansky set, but he's still very tight to all of these people, so it's very weird. Eventually, in November 1970, Hughes is taken out of Vegas on a plane that's on Adnan Khashoggi's plane, if you know who Adnan Khashoggi is. He factors in 9/11 as well. I mean, couldn't make it up, stuff up. Nixon also had a war on drugs, and I just want to remind people of the power of the executive branch if they choose to use it. They just shot these guys in Venezuela. Well, Nixon was using E. Howard Hunt and others to try to assassinate drug dealers in Mexico. It seems that Nixon was, as mob-connected as he was trying to, or his administration was trying to restructure the mafia somehow, the crime syndicate. And there are all these things about the mafia versus the CIA that you can find. This article is very straightforward, the title, but there seemed to be this conflict between the CIA and then mob-connected forces that's going on at the time. You can find articles that are written in the press where they're saying, this Italian mafia thing doesn't really capture it all. That Lansky seems to have more power than anyone. And this was getting written in articles across the country in the newspapers in this early window, the early 70s. Okay, and at the same time, Lansky is like a focal point for strange, deep political maneuverings. Sidney Zion here writes an article in Harper's in 72 advocating for the U.S. to allow Lansky to stay in Israel and for Israel to let him stay there. This is, Harper's Magazine is flacking for the biggest mobster in the world. Sidney Korshak, who's a mob lawyer, labor fixer. There's an article by John Sinclair, who John Lennon once did a famous benefit for, that talks about how Korshak was trying to use sexual blackmail against Kissinger so he could get Kissinger to tell Israel that it was okay to have Meyer Lansky stay there. Sidney Korshak is doing this. Now, there's also, under Nixon, who knew that the CIA could mess with his plans, he's worried about this Bay of Pigs thing, right? That's what he says in the Smoking Gun tape. At one point, he tries to get Dick Helms, the head of the CIA. He goes to the CIA director. He's his boss. He's the president. And he says, hey, the who shot John angle. Is Eisenhower to blame? Is it Kennedy? Is it Johnson? Is it Nixon? Et cetera, et cetera. It may become a big issue. And if it does, I need to know what's necessary to protect the dirty tricks department and the intelligence community and all this, and I'll protect it, but just tell me about who killed JFK. But he's doing this because he knows the CIA, what they did to Kennedy, they could do to him. I think this is the only interpretation. And they didn't do the same thing to Kennedy, but they ultimately do get rid of him. I'm gonna skip this, but again, I think what ends up happening to Nixon is a similar coalition of mob, drug-corrupted syndicate forces, Central Intelligence Agency, and it's being intertwined with them, and then right-wingers who opposed Nixon's opening to China and détente and other things Nixon was trying to do at the time to move the country in a less bellicose direction. I have hours of this stuff on my American Exception podcast, but I won't try to go through it here because we've only got a couple minutes left. And this is impossible to really go through and do justice to. But at the Deep Throat's warning to Bob Woodward in May of 73, he says, everyone's life is in danger. The covert activities involve the whole U.S. intelligence community, and they're incredible. Deep Throat refused to give specifics because it's against the law. The cover-up had little to do with Watergate, but was mainly to protect the covert operations. What I think happens here is, in part, the syndicate and Israel's connection to it gave them an enormous trove of blackmail to use essentially against the U.S. They knew all the secrets of the U.S. And in that little time, in the spring of 67, a bunch of them come out at once. I think that this has happened in other ways. It makes you really question Trump as he is, trying to disclose things about JFK and so on. It makes you wonder who is pushing this and why, even though I want disclosure on everything, which I'm just going to skip ahead here. And some of these things are beyond belief, but I found them to be true. One example, BCCI, Peter told, in the book about BCCI, you find out that it was spearheaded by Robert Morgenthau, who was one of the main people behind the clandestine effort to get Israel the atomic bomb. That's very weird. Peter investigated this in Senator Kerry's office and found that the guy he was working for, Jack Blum, was essentially a Mossad or an Israeli agent. So why is Israel or Israeli forces trying to take down BCCI? And what the successor to BCCI is called Far West. It's very obscure, but it seems to do the same things the BCCI was doing, but it seems to be more firmly in the control of Israeli actors. So what I'm saying is the fix, the ability to control the fix, the ability to control the drug traffic, and to control some of the exception, the assassination operations. I think that the Zionists have been able to use this to blackmail the U.S. and shift U.S. foreign policy. Because the imperialism was so corrupt anyway in the first place, the desire to rule the world, that they just the U.S. opened itself up to that. And we as political scientists we talk about the state as a black box and it's a rational actor and so on, but we have a hard time as social scientists dealing with legitimately crazy political formations. But I think if you look at Gaza and what is happening, you have to conclude this is not something that is like, oh yes, the capitalist class does this and that and so on. What do you do with actual crazy political formations? And how do you even conceptualize what they are capable of? There's more that I could say on this, and I'll probably give another version of this elsewhere because I have too much here. I've been working too long on this. It's really mind-blowing material, but I'm going to skip to the end, which is the takeaway, and I hope that this resonates with people who were looking for just 9/11 minutia and forensic detail. So here's my conclusion. The US regime in 2025 is one big, beautiful, deep state fix. The neocon takeover of US foreign policy has been catastrophic, especially the post-9/11 forever wars. The neoliberal oligarchy of private wealth has turned every major sector of the economy into an avenue for billionaire rent-seeking. However we wish to apportion blame to Zionists, militarists, Wall Street, or the syndicate, the US-led West is in shambles with essentially no possibility of restoring its dominance. The best hope for a soft landing lies in spectacular disclosure. The truth about JFK and the other 1960s assassinations, the Gray Alliance, the 9/11/Amerithrax, Epstein, etc. Any of these could serve as a 9/11 in reverse that could provide the shock needed for fundamental reform along lawful and democratic lines. The US can no longer function as a lawless and exploitative global sovereign. Truth, reconciliation, and deep reform are the only reasonable ways forward. I apologize for not being able to get more to my 9/11 material. I've just been immersed in this for quite a long time, and I could go on for probably 3 hours or 4 hours if it was allowed. So I hope that people appreciated that.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Fabulous. Wow. You really tied together a lot there.